Take a look at your crew around you right now. Think about your family, your coworkers, your closest friends. I guarantee you know exactly who I'm talking about when I describe them. The one who has to be in charge, the one who double checks every knot before we sail, the one who quietly mediates the fight over the last barrel of rum so nobody gets stabbed, and the one who somehow charms the captain out of swab duty with a joke and a grin. Are these random personalities, or were these assigned roles that they got the absolute second they were born? Welcome back to the Pirate Therapist. I am Lee Perry. I am the Pirate Therapist, and I am your host today. So today we're diving into birth order theory. Why the order in which you arrived in your family might just be the invisible compass that steers your entire life. So if you've ever looked at your siblings and thought, how did we come from the exact same parents and end up this different? You're not alone, and you aren't imagining things. A lot of people confuse this with something called family constellations, which is a mystical approach to inherited trauma. But what we're talking about today is pure grounded psychology. Back in the early 1900s, a psychotherapist named Alfred Adler realized something profound. He realized that you don't actually grow up in the same environment as your siblings. Now, think about it. If you are the oldest, you were born to a pair of terrified, hypervigilant, first time parents who watched your every move. You had their undivided attention, and then suddenly an intruder showed up. If you're the middle child, you were born into a world where you always had to share. You never had the spotlight to yourself, so you learned how to negotiate early to survive. And if you're the youngest, you were born to seasoned parents who were exhausted, relaxed, and just happy that you didn't fall overboard. You learned how to use charm and humor to get what you needed from the bigger kids. Now, today, we're going to break down the psychology behind the achiever, the peacemaker, and the charmer. We're going to talk about the massive strengths that come with your birth order. And more importantly, we're going to look at the psychological traps that these roles set up for us as adults. Now, the survival skills that you learned to navigate your childhood might be exactly what is sinking your adult relationships. So, whether you're the bossy first mate, the overlooked navigator, or the charming stowaway, grab yourself a seat at the tavern. Let's figure out who you actually are and when you stop playing that role that you were born into. Now, Alfred Adler was born on February 7th in 1870 in Vienna, Austria. Early in his life, he suffered severe health issues, including rickets and near fatal pneumonia, which sparked his lifelong interest in medicine and the human drive to overcome physical and psychological weaknesses. He became a physician and a psychiatrist, eventually joining Sigmund Freud's inner circle in Vienna. In fact, Adler was the first president of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. However, Adler fundamentally disagreed with Freud's belief that human behavior is driven primarily by unconscious sexual conflicts. Adler believed that people are conscious, creative beings driven by a social connection, a need to belong, and a desire to overcome feelings of inadequacy. Because of these deep philosophical differences, Adler broke away from Freud in 1911 and founded his own school of thought, individual psychology. Now, Adler is widely considered to be one of the three great fathers of modern psychotherapy, alongside Freud and Carl Jung, and is recognized as the very first community psychologist. He established the first child guidance clinics in Vienna and spent his later years lecturing extensively in the United States until his death in 1937. So, what is Alfred Adler best known for? A few things, including birth order, but let's look at the first one, the inferiority complex. We've all heard of that. Adler is the psychologist who originally coined the term inferiority feeling, which later evolved into a popular culture into the inferiority complex. When people use the phrase inferiority complex, they usually mean somebody who's deeply insecure. But Alfred Adler, the guy who actually coined the term, meant something more specific. And honestly, it's a lot more relatable. Adler pointed out something so obvious that we usually forget it. Every single one of us started out completely helpless. You were born small and weak and totally dependent on these giants moving around you to walk, to talk, and open the fridge. So Adler according to him, says feeling inferior isn't some rare psychological defect. It's literally the default human starting point. Adler didn't think that feeling inferior was a bad thing. In fact, he said it's the exact thing that drives us to grow. You feel small, so you learn to walk. You feel left out, so you learn to tell jokes. You feel weak in one area, so you compensate by getting really good at something else. Here's where the complex part comes in. A healthy person feels a sense of lack and says, okay, I'm going to practice and get better. But sometimes, usually because of our early environment, that feeling of inadequacy becomes so heavy that we can't overcome it. It stops being a challenge that we can meet and starts becoming our whole identity. That is an inferiority complex. And what's wild is how it shows up. Yes, sometimes it looks like the person who withdraws, avoids failure, and shrinks into the background. But a lot of the time, the inferiority complex looks like the exact opposite. It looks like the boss who has to micromanage everything. It looks like the coworker who always has to one up your stories. Or it could look like the perfectionist who will burn themselves out just to prove that they are valuable. Adler actually argued that when someone is acting arrogant or superior, it's almost always a mask to cover up how deeply inadequate they feel inside. So, what does this have to do with you? Well, if you find yourself constantly exhausted by the role you're playing, whether it's the overachiever or the people pleaser, or perhaps the person who always has to be right, it might be worth asking yourself, what feeling am I trying to outrun right now? Because true confidence isn't about proving that you're the best one on the ship. It's about not panicking when you realize you're just human like the rest of us. Adler is perhaps the most is most famous today for being the first psychologist to theorize that a child's chronological placement in their family profoundly shapes their personality. Adler argued that siblings do not share the same psychological environment. Based on when they arrive, each child must figure out a unique way to gain attention, power, and belonging within the family system. The firstborns, Adler believed that the oldest child experiences undivided attention until they are dethroned by the second child. To compensate and win back parental approval, they often become highly responsible, organized, and authoritarian, acting as a second parent to the younger children. When Adler talked about the firstborn children, he believed they start life in a very particular position. For a while, they have all the adults to themselves. Then they are the only child in the center of attention, the one everybody is watching and photographing, correcting, and celebrating. Then at some point, another child shows up, and Adler says the firstborn often experience that kind of dethroning when the second one comes along. Now, that's such a dramatic word, dethroned, but honestly, it fits. Suddenly, the child who was once the entire story is now expected to share the stage. And a lot of firstborns respond by becoming more responsible, more helpful. They try and be more mature and more identified with being the good one, or if not the good one, the capable one. So if you're a firstborn, there's a decent chance you learned early that love and security felt tied to your competence. You may have figured out, without anyone saying it directly, that one way to keep your place in the family is to be useful. Be the one who remembers, be the one who helps, be the one who does it right. Adler associated firstborns with responsibility, order, and authority for exactly that reason. But let's be honest, firstborn energy is easy to spot. It's the person that makes the plan and brings the extra charger. It's the one that notices the deadlines and quietly starts managing everybody else when things start to fall apart. It's the kid who got promoted to assistant parent without really applying for the job. Adler believed firstborns often become organizers and leaders, but can also become rigid, controlling, and overly invested in rules and approval. And that has some real strengths. Firstborns often grow into adults who are dependable and conscientious and protective and incredibly capable. They carry a lot, they lead well, and they create stability for the people around them. If your world is on fire, the firstborn is usually already holding a clipboard asking who called the insurance company. But there's also a shadow side to that role. When your identity gets built around being the responsible one, you may stop knowing who you are outside of being that competent person. You may struggle to rest and struggle to ask for help, or feel quietly resentful that everyone assumes you can handle more. Those patterns fit Adler's view that firstborns often adapt by becoming highly dutiful and authority oriented after losing their original place at the center of focus or at the center of the family. A lot of firstborns are not just trying to succeed, they're trying to stay safe by staying impressive. They may feel anxious when things are messy and uncomfortable when they're not in control. Or maybe they feel ashamed when they need something from other people. And it's because they are often praised for being mature and they can miss out on something very important. Being allowed to be small and uncertain, being allowed to need things, or maybe just not finishing something. That needs to be okay. They miss out on that. So, this is where the role can become exhausting. The firstborn can start to believe that if I'm not useful, then I am a burden. If I am not composed, I'm failing. And now we're no longer talking about a birth order pattern. We're talking about a whole identity organized around over functioning. So, in really human terms, the firstborn story often sounds like this: I learned to matter by being dependable. And that strategy may have worked beautifully in childhood, and it may even have made you the person that everybody trusts. But in adulthood, it can leave you carrying relationships instead of participating in them, performing strength instead of feeling supported, and confusing love with responsibility. I think that is the part worth slowing down for, because the firstborn is not just the achiever of the family. Often, they're the child who discovered that being good at everything was the safest way to keep belonging. Adler's framework suggests that this role grows out of that early shift from being only one to having to compete for significance in a changed family system. So, if this is you, maybe the question isn't, am I a classic firstborn? Maybe the deeper question is, what happens to me when I'm not the strong one? What happens when I do not manage the room or hold the plan or keep everybody else okay? Because healing from the firstborn may look like learning that you are still worthy when you're not carrying the entire load yourself. Let's talk about the middle or the second children. Adler noticed that the second child is born sharing the spotlight and always has a pace setter ahead of them. Because of this, they're often very competitive, diplomatic, and driven to succeed in areas where the oldest child does not excel. So let's talk about the middle child. If you are the middle child, you probably already assume I was going to skip this section or forget it entirely. And that is exactly what Alfred Adler would have predicted. According to Adler, the middle child is born into a fundamentally different world than the oldest. The oldest child knew what it was like to be the center of the universe. The youngest child usually gets babied and protected because the parents are exhausted and just happy that everybody is surviving. But the middle child arrives onto the ship that is already crowded, and they never, not even for one day, get the captain's undivided attention. Adler said the middle child is essentially sandwiched between the pace setter ahead of them, the older sibling who's always bigger, faster, and allowed to do more things, and they have a pursuer behind them, the younger sibling who gets away with everything and demands a ton of care. Because of this, the middle children often struggle to figure out their exact role. They aren't the adorable baby. So who are they? Well, because they have to share resources from day one, middle children often become absolute masters of negotiation, diplomacy, and compromise. They learn very quickly how to read a room, how to mediate the fight over the TV remote, and how to keep the peace. In fact, Adler, who was the middle child himself, by the way, believed that middle children are often the most adaptable and emotionally stable kids in the family. But there's a flip side to this, and it's now what we call the middle child syndrome, because they are often overlooked in favor of milestones of the oldest or the needs of the youngest. Middle children can develop deep, quiet belief that they are just not special. They can feel neglected, overshadowed, and like their voice doesn't actually matter. So, how do they cope with that? Adler noticed that they usually go in one of two ways. The first way is rebellion or intense competition. The oldest child is the star athlete, or the middle child might become the theater kid. Hi. They carve out a completely different niche so they can finally stand out and get some recognition. The second way they cope is by leaning heavily into people pleasing. They become the low maintenance child. They don't ask for much, they don't rock the boat, and they try to earn love by being the easy one. And because they often feel a lack of deep connection inside the family, middle children are notorious for building incredibly strong, loyal friendships outside of the house. Their friends become their chosen family. As an adult, this plays out in very specific ways. If you're a middle child, you might be an amazing team player and a deeply loyal partner. You probably handle conflict beautifully, but you might also realize that you have a really hard time advocating for yourself. You might realize that you're always the one compromising, always the one swallowing your own needs just to keep the peace, and always the last one to ask for help when you're drowning. So, if this is your story, the challenge for you isn't learning how to get along with people. You've probably got a PhD in that. The challenge is learning how to take up space. It's learning that you don't have to be the easy one in order to be worthy of love. And that's okay to finally raise your hand and say, hey, what about me? Now let's move on to the youngest child. The baby of the family is never dethroned and is often pampered by both parents and older siblings. Adler believed this makes them highly charming and sociable, but also prone to being dependent or manipulative, since others have always done the things for them. When Adler looked at the youngest child, he saw someone born into a family where older siblings are already bigger, louder, and more capable. So the youngest has to find a totally different way in order to matter. Now, unlike the oldest child, the youngest never gets dethroned. And Adler believed that that can leave them both protected and a little pampered by the family system. So the youngest often grows up surrounded by people who are already doing things first. Somebody else has walked first. Somebody else got the first report card. Other people broke the parents in as parents and probably got blamed for all the family experiments. By the time the youngest arrives, the household can be more relaxed, more indulgent, or at least less alarmed by every little thing. Adler thought that that shapes the youngest child's personality in very specific ways. A lot of youngest kids learn pretty quickly that they are probably not going to win through authority. They are not the built in leader, and they're not usually the one everyone automatically treats as responsible. So instead, they often get good at being charming, and maybe if they're funny or creative, they try and create a warmth and bring that to the table. Or maybe just being entertaining. Adler associated the youngest children with being sociable and engaging, in part because they often learn that to get attention through personality rather than through rank or effort. Honestly, you can usually feel that energy pretty fast. The youngest child is often the one who can talk about, or they can talk their way out of trouble. They can soften tension with a joke or somehow convince everybody else to help them while making it look adorable. And they can be playful and emotionally expressive and adventurous and surprisingly bold, especially because they have spent their whole life trying to keep up with people who are older and more advanced than they are. But that role has a shadow side too. You notice how they all have a good side and maybe a darker side. Well, Adler warned that when a youngest child is overly indulged, they may struggle with dependence, frustration tolerance, or the expectation that other people will step in and handle things for them. In other words, sometimes the same child who looks spontaneous and charming on the outside is also quietly terrified of being taken seriously, being left to tend or to fend for themselves, or finding out that they just can't keep up without help. So in adulthood, the youngest child can end up with a strange mix of gifts and insecurities. They may be magnetic and funny and relational and full of life, but they may also avoid responsibility. They're bad at procrastination, or good at it, I guess. That just depends on how you look at it, or doubt their own competence when things get hard. They can become the person who says, I work best under pressure, when what's really happening is I'm not fully convinced I can do this unless somebody rescues me at the last minute. And to be fair, sometimes youngest children overcorrect in the other direction. Because they're used to being seen as the baby, they may become intensely driven to prove that they're just as capable as everyone else, sometimes even more so. Adler's broader point was that the birth order can shape the strategy the child uses to find belonging. And for the youngest, that strategy often revolves around standing out through likability and originality, somehow finding a way to make themselves special. So, if this is your story, the deeper question may Not be, am I the fun one? It may be, what happens to me when being fun, charming, and easy is not enough to secure my place. Because healing for the youngest child may look a lot like learning that you do not have to stay little to stay loved. And you do not have to perform delight to be taken seriously. That's the oldest, the middle, and the youngest, the birth order. That's what Adler is probably best known for. But he also had the inferiority complex. And now the last thing that he's well known for is social interest. So, above all, Adler believed that mental health is defined by social interest, a deep, genuine feeling of connection to the human race and a desire to contribute to the community. He believed that the true healing comes not from analyzing the past, but from taking responsibility and working for the common good. When Adler talked about social interest, he was talking about a person's sense of connection to other people and their willingness to contribute to the common good. He saw this as a central part of mental health, not just a nice extra trait for especially kind people. Now, that matters because Adler did not think psychological health was mainly about power and status and proving yourself. He believed that it was a healthy, it's that the healthier person becomes, the less they're driven by self protection, the more they're able to live with courage and belonging and real concern for the people around them. And honestly, that is a pretty radical idea. A lot of us grow up thinking the goal is to be impressive, to be the smartest one or the strongest one, the most admired one, the one nobody can criticize for anything. But Adler believed that when your whole identity is organized around being above other people, that usually points to insecurity, not health. That connects directly to his whole theory about inferiority. Adler believed we all begin life with feelings of weakness and inadequacy, and then spend our lives trying to respond to those feelings somehow. Some people respond by growing, learning, and contributing. Other people respond by chasing superiority and control, some kind of importance, because they're trying to escape the pain of feeling small. So, social interest is Adler's answer to that problem. It is a movement away from how do I prove that I matter and toward how do I participate in a meaningful way. It is the shift from competition to contribution, from image to connection, from needing to dominate the room to being able to share life with other people. In really practical terms, social interest means you stop seeing other people as threats or audiences or even obstacles. You start to see them as humans. Fellow humans. Adler believed that the real wellness shows up in our capacity for cooperation and community and usefulness, not just in how confident or successful we look from the outside. And I think that that is where this gets really personal because a lot of us are skilled at surviving, but we're not always skilled at belonging. We know how to perform, impress, and rescue, to compete and to stay needed. But Adler's idea of healing is deeper than that. He is asking whether you can actually live in a way that is connected, that is mutually respectful and rooted in a shared humanity, a shared community. So, if you want to put that in one simple question, it might be this: is my life built around proving my worth or participating in life with other people? Adler believed that the more we move towards connection and contribution, the healthier we become. And that is such a helpful lens for birth order, too. Maybe the firstborn learns to turn responsibility into genuine service instead of control. Maybe the middle child learns to use their diplomacy without disappearing themselves. And maybe the youngest learns to bring warmth and creativity without needing to stay small to stay loved. Now, in Adler's framework, the healthiest version of any role is the one that moves towards contribution and connection. So, social interest is not just about being nice, it's Adler's way of saying that healing is relational. It's about becoming the kind of person who can belong to the human community without needing to be above it. So, I want to talk about birth order again just a little bit. I want to give you some examples from modern culture, from the TV world, if you will. So, here's a few recognizable TV characters that perfectly illustrate Adler's birth order, his theory, and his social concept of social interest. Now, I apologize if my references are dated. The older I get, the more dated my references will become. Thank you for putting up with my aging references. So, Let's talk about the firstborn, Monica Geller. If you're familiar with the show Friends, you should know who Monica is. If you want to explain the firstborn experience, look at Monica Geller. Monica is the ultimate Adlerian firstborn, hyper responsible, aggressively organized, deeply invested in being the hostess who takes care of everyone else. Now, Adler argued that firstborns respond to being dethroned by younger siblings by becoming competent, rule following, and slightly authoritarian so they can regain their parents' approval. We see this constantly with Monica. She organizes holidays, she cooks the meals, she enforces the apartment rules, and literally hyperventilates if a throw pillow is out of place. But underneath that bossy exterior is a classic firstborn vulnerability. She equates her worth with her usefulness. In Adlerian terms, Monica uses extreme competence to ward off feelings of inferiority. She doesn't just like being in charge. She needs to be the one holding the group together because that is her strategy for securing her place in her chosen family. Now let's look at the middle child. I have a couple examples here that immediately pop to mind. Stephanie Tanner from Full House or Jan Brady from the Brady Bunch. Jan Brady is the historical poster child for middle child syndrome. Marcia, Marcia, Marcia. But Stephanie Tanner from Full House is more nuanced. Relatable example of how a middle child navigates a crowded family ship. So the Adlerian breakdown would be Adler pointed out that the middle child is sandwiched between a pace setter and a pursuer. Stephanie grew up exactly like this. DJ was the responsible, mature older sister, the pace setter, and Michelle was the adorable, show stealing baby, the pursuer. Because middle kids feel squeezed out of extreme roles, Adler said they often cope by becoming rebellious, hyper independent, or craving attention. Stephanie constantly struggled to find her identity outside of DJ's shadow and Michelle's cuteness, which is why she often acted out, snooped, and developed dramatic catchphrases. How rude, just to be noticed. Yet, true to Adler's theory, she also became the most emotionally adaptable and observant sister, constantly mediating the family dynamics because she was used to sharing the space. The best example I can think of for the youngest child mentality would be Tom Haverford from Parks and Rec. For the youngest child, Tom Haverford is a brilliant example of what Adler meant when he warned about the pampered baby of the family who relies on charm instead of hard work. According to Adler, youngest children never have to deal with a younger sibling replacing them, so they often remain the baby. Because they can't compete with adults and other siblings on sheer competence or authority, they learn to win people over with entertainment and humor or big, flashy ideas. Tom Haverford is Parks Department's youngest sibling. He is obsessed with style. He completely avoids any hard labor and relies entirely on his charisma to get out of trouble. When faced with actual responsibility, he usually delegates it or invents a ridiculous business idea like Entertainment 720 rather than grinding through the work. However, true to the youngest child's positive traits, he is also the most visionary, socially connected, and optimistic person in the office. Now let's look at social interest. Who represents that? Ted Lasso. If the idea that mental health is defined by our genuine connection to others and our desire to contribute to the community, Ted Lasso is the perfect modern example. Adler believed that unhealthy people are driven by an inferiority complex, which makes them self obsessed, competitive, and desperate for power to prove that they matter. Healthy people, on the other hand, have high social interest. They don't need to dominate the room, they just want to build up the team. When Ted arrives at AFC Richmond, he is surrounded by characters who lack social interest. Jamie Tart is obsessed with his own ego, Roy Kent is isolated by his anger, and Rebecca is driven by revenge. Ted operates entirely differently. He doesn't care if he looks foolish. He doesn't need to assert dominance. And his entire coaching philosophy is about creating belonging, courage, and mutual respect among his players. He literally bakes biscuits for his boss every morning just to build a connection. Ted proves Adler's ultimate point. True strength doesn't come from being superior to other people. It comes from having the courage just to care about them. So what happens if you've been listening to all of this and thinking, okay, I definitely recognize myself in these roles. but I don't want to be this way forever. So, how do I actually change a personality pattern that you've been practicing since you were a toddler? The good news is that Alfred Adler was fundamentally a psychologist of hope. Unlike Freud, who believed that we are hopelessly trapped by our childhoods, Adler believed that humans are creative and capable of change at any age. He believed that our birth order doesn't dictate our destiny, it shapes the strategy that we originally used to feel safe and significant. And if you learned a strategy once, you can learn a new one now. So let's shift these patterns a little bit and look at Adler's concept of private logic. Your private logic is the unspoken rule book that you wrote when you were a kid about how the world works and what you have to do to survive it. If you're firstborn, your private logic might be I only matter if I'm useful and in control. If you're the middle child, your private logic might be I only matter if I am low maintenance or don't ask for too much. And if you're the youngest child, your private logic might be I only matter if I'm charming and other people take care of the hard stuff. The way you change your personality pattern is by catching your private logic in real time and aggressively challenging it. In Adlerian therapy, there's an amazing technique for this called catching oneself. The goal isn't to magically stop being a perfectionist or a people pleaser overnight. The goal is simply to notice when you're doing it, pause, and say, oh, there I go again. I am treating this work like a work meeting, and I'm the oldest sibling who has to save the family. Well, once you catch it, you can practice the acting as if. You literally run a behavioral experiment. If you're the oldest, you act as if the world won't end if you let someone else plan the vacation. If you're the middle, you act as if your preference actually matters and you state out loud where you want to go for dinner. If you are the youngest, you act as if you are entirely capable of handling a difficult conversation without making jokes to deflect the tension. Now, at first, this is going to feel awful. It will feel like you are breaking the universal survival rule of your family. But Adler promised that the more you practice acting as if, the more you realize that you are no longer that child fighting for your spot on the ship. You don't have to perform your role to be worthy of love. You just have to show up with courage and social interest as the adult that you are today. So today, we explored Alfred Adler's idea of birth order and how it can shape the roles that we take on in a family. Not because our fate is sealed, but because each of us is trying to find belonging and significance and just find our place in that system. We look at how firstborns may become responsible and controlling, and middle children may become adaptable and easy to overlook. And the youngest children may lean on charm and creativity as their way of staying connected. We also talked about Adler's idea of inferiority feelings, the reality that all of us begin life small and dependent and aware that we're not very powerful, and how these feelings can either drive growth or harden into an inferiority complex. And underneath all of it was Adler's deeper point. Real psychological health is not about being the most impressive person in the room, but about developing social interest, which means connection and contribution and learning how to live alongside other people with courage and with care. So maybe the question is not just what birth order am I? Maybe the deeper question is what role did I learn to play in order to stay loved? And more importantly, do I still need to play that role? This has been The Pirate Therapist. I'm your host, Lee Perry. So until next time, mind your compass, cover your aft, and remember, you are more than the role you learned just to survive. You're still evolving. You're still becoming that best version of yourself. So keep up the good work, and I will see you next week.